please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Hello and welcome to the CNBC TV18 special. I'm Shireen Bhan. My guest today has been described as a liberal, forward-looking thinker. He's also been credited for bringing life to the economic survey. I might add colour to the economic survey as well. Thanks very much for joining us here on CNBC TV18. Arvind Subramanian, it's always a pleasure. Let me start by talking to you about this debate that's been going on about imported and exported experts versus domestic homegrown experts. And I think the idea of imported ideas being disconnected from Indian realities can be debunked easily. But let me leave that aside. The other criticism, which may perhaps have some legitimacy, is the fact that you don't have any skin in the game. You might be sectoral experts, you come into government machinery, you end up being, perhaps, to quote you in your own words, technocratic cogs in the vast government machinery. How do you ensure that your ideas actually work?
Yeah, but I think that, but I thought, see, the question is whether we can be, whether effectiveness depends upon whether you come from abroad or come from within. Yeah.
That argument can be debunked.
Okay. So now we're not talking about. So we're talking about how do basically outside technocrats become effective.
Yes.
Right. I think there are no simple solutions for that. Obviously, it depends very much on the person in the job itself, and it also depends upon what the arrangements that the government makes to facilitate this. But I think it depends mostly on the incumbent. I mean, if the person who comes in can forge relationships, build trust, show that he or she is useful, and then then it can create a virtuous dynamic where more and more people want that person's services, and then actually this vast machine embraces you and looks to you for advice, ideas, and so on. So, or you can be on a negative dynamic where you come in, you're not effective, people don't listen to you, therefore you're not even more ineffective, and so on. So I think there's no kind of formula for this, I think, but a lot depends upon who comes in, and so that's what.
So in your words, do you feel less useful today than you did maybe 3 years ago?
I mean, see, it's for others to judge how effective I've been, but I've had just fabulous working relationships with so many people in government, outside government, ministers, cabinet, chief ministers, finance ministers. So I don't think I've had a problem of working with government machinery at all. But of course, that's for others to judge how effective I've been. But I've certainly enjoyed myself.
Let me talk to you about several of the ideas that you've put forward through the economic survey. And let me start by talking to you about the one that's been talked about the most, which is the identification of the twin balance sheet problem and then the remedy thereon. Do you believe that post-diagnosis, the kind of work, the effort, the ideas, the elements that ought to have been put forward maybe took too long to put in place?
See, I think that's a good and open question. I think we can legitimately ask whether it took us longer than it should have. And by us, we mean both the government and the RBI, because both have had roles in this. And I think you could make the case, because remember, I think it's a very fair question, because the twin balance sheet challenge, I think we've had almost since about 2011 or so, or maybe even 2010. So it's been 7-8 years and counting. And I think I would say that, say between then and 2014, nothing happened, right? So we lost about 3-4 years right there. Then once 2014 happened, I think when did we start taking serious actions? I think there was Indra Dhanush, then there was the asset quality review, and then the IBC. So I would say maybe it took longer than it should have. It's possible. But I don't think it was because of not recognizing that there was a problem.
Was it a growth bet? Was the hope that we're in an environment of growth and that will ride us through this?
I think that's certainly part of the problem. I think there were 3 things I think that can explain why it took so long. Maybe 4 things. I think, right? One, I think that remember that in 15 and 15-16, the economy growth was actually accelerating.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. If growth is actually accelerating, people say, what's the problem? If we're getting this growth, there's no underlying problem. And also maybe growth itself will make some of these assets look better. I think so. That was, I think, one reason why maybe it took longer than it should have. Second, I think that the IBC legislation and all the necessary ingredients that needed to be put in place only were in place by late 2016. I think the legislation was passed then. So I think that policymakers at some level perhaps realized...
Underestimated the problem?
No, I think that maybe, remember that I proposed a bad bank.
Yeah.
And I was, I wanted the bad bank to be done earlier.
Yes.
But I think somewhere maybe the policymakers realized that you needed a judicial framework for this, and that's why it took longer, because maybe the bad bank could have been set up earlier, but you couldn't have this unless the IBC legislation was in place, and I think that's why it took some time. I think the third reason it took some time was, I think, let's be honest about this, I think that even though people knew that there were lots of toxic assets in the system, there was never any kind of public acknowledgement of that. And that's why I think when the asset quality review in March 2016 gave the first results, I think everyone generally accepted that, oh, actually the scale of the problem is quite large, it's not going to be solved just through growth alone, and we need to take more actions. So I think a combination of, the growth bet, as you said, the fact that the IBC was not yet in place, the fact that there was no public acceptance until the asset quality review was done, that there are all these bad assets. I think a combination of these things then explain why the actions came when they did.
Okay. Do you feel confident now, in light of, whether it's the IBC or the various measures that have been announced by the government, that we are firmly the worst is firm behind us, and that we are now on the path to being able to clean up, so to speak, the banking system? And how long do you believe that will take? If you talk to bankers, they'll tell you, the worst is behind us. But then the next quarter, you look at the numbers. What do you feel at this point in time?
Yeah, I think we need to be honest about this. I think, I think the IBC was a major reform, absolutely transformational in terms of debtor-creditor relations, exit, and I think we've seen some early successes under that. So I think we've done, very well, and I think the worst is behind us on the recognition side. But remember, there's always what I call the Subramanian law of non-recognition, that at any point in time, the scale of bad assets is 20% greater than what anyone is telling you at that point of time. So
you're saying it could be worse than what we currently are dealing with?
I think we've made great progress. I think a little bit more maybe can come out, but I think there we've made, pretty much, I think you should never say these things definitively, but I think we've made a lot of progress on recognition. And now I think we probably are close to understanding and acknowledging the true scale of the problem. Resolution, IBC, fantastic, great work, but I think we have to be honest and have a constant review of, are we making progress as fast as we should? And I think we're making progress, but I think it's not as fast as why? I think partly the NCLT process is overburdened. Partly, I think the necessary process of getting every verdict approved by the Supreme Court, which was unavoidable, is unavoidable. Because remember, stigmatized capitalism is a phrase that I use.
Yes.
When you have that, you need this judicial imprimatur on all these things, because that's what the public accepts as legitimate. So that some delay is unavoidable. But I think some NCLT may be overburdened. We need to find ways of unburdening NCLT.
Is the AMC the way to unburden the NCLT?
I don't know. I haven't studied enough, but I certainly think greater thought may need to be given, for example, to seeing whether some sectors should require sui generis treatment or not.
What, like power? Like
power, for example. I think that's something that we need to think. I know I don't have. I mean, obviously I have ideas, but I've not thought them through yet. But I think we need to think collectively about, because there is something quite distinctive about the power sector. There are three things that are distinctive about the power sector. One, I think that these are good assets.
Yeah.
They can't just be liquidated. One. Two, that you can't have, or rather, if given government policy today, you get bidding on these assets, the valuations will probably be too low to be acceptable, right? And three, which I think is the most important point, that extracting more value from these assets, it relies on government policy and government action. So this is a sector that actually the government can take a number of actions to kind of increase the valuation and how much value can be extracted. So these are, I mean, for example, tariffs, for example, NTPC, lots of things that the government can do, and there are many things. So for these reasons, I think we need to have a discussion on whether, we need a kind of sui generis treatment. So that's on the recognition. We have to be candid about that. On recapitalization and reform, I think there's still some ways to go because recapitalization, we don't know what the valuations are going to emerge. We don't know what's going to happen in the power sector, and therefore, God knows whether we may need, and banks' own ability to raise capital at this stage is limited. So I think recapitalization, and moreover, the most important, the reform part of it. Recapitalization should not be done divorced from reform. And I think on reform, frankly, we need to make a lot more progress.
Does that disappoint you? Because that certainly disappoints members in the RBI who've spoken out saying that governance reforms within the banking sector have taken a backseat. Would you agree?
See, I don't want to assign blame. I think
no, it's not about us assigning blame. If you're being candid to say that the recognition problem has been addressed, but the resolution problem still has some distance to cover, then would you say that the reform problem has even more distance to cover?
I would agree, absolutely. I think reform has a long way to go. I would say though that see, there are two sets of reforms. I mean, reforms for two sets of banks, right? One is the banks that are maybe not viable fundamentally in the long run.
Under the PCA.
Under the PCA. And I think the PCA is, I think the RBI deserves credit for the way they've handled the whole PCA thing, because in the long run, we do want these banks to become narrow banks, whatever, shrink their balance sheet, but do it in a gradual fashion. I think that it's the other banks, governance reform may be one, but I think the whole question of whether we need more private sector participation, I think that's still an open question, and what kind of regulation we will need going forward, because remember that while the public sector banks have been the big part of the challenge, recently we're discovering that these problems also occurred in private sector banking.
Sure.
So I think, yes, we need to make a lot more progress on the reform side, and on the regulation side.
Since you're talking about reform and regulation in banking and you were talking about private sector participation in the banking sector, how do you then explain the government's decision to try and get LIC to pick up IDBI Bank?
You see, I haven't studied this very closely, what LIC and IDBI involve. Certainly, it's more in the nature of a merger than privatization.
Sure.
Yeah, but if it's possible, via this route, to actually get majority private sector participation in IDBI.
Eventually,
eventually, that's one possibility. If we could, then then this would be maybe a price worth paying for that outcome.
Since we talked about this business of stigmatized capitalism, which is what you have been concerned about, what are the implications, not just for the banking sector, but for private investment, for a pickup in the economy? Today in Parliament, we've got a debate on the Fugitive Economic Offenders Bill. Right, down your corridor in the Financial Services Department, they're talking about revocation of passports of possible economic offenders. Is this going to make matters worse or better when it comes to destigmatizing capitalism?
It's a good question. See, I think firstly, stigmatized capitalism is a long-standing problem. I think it's the result of cumulative result of all that's happened over the last many years. Now, stigmatized capitalism means two or three things. One, it means that private sector entry into new areas is not going to be a problem. I think that can proceed, like we've seen in airline, we've seen in telecom, we've seen in even new private sector banks coming in the different. I think entry into new sectors new private investments, it's not. I think stigmatized capitalism bites most in terms of handing over public sector assets to the private sector.
So strategic disinvestment is dead.
So I think that, not dead, I think it's going to be challenging. It's going to be difficult because of, one. Two, it also means that because of stigmatized capitalism, I think the judiciary is going to have a greater role to play in many of these decisions. That's why IBC framework, probably better than bad bank idea that I was propagating. So the judiciary is going to have a much greater role. The third, which comes to the point that you said about, see, I mean, it is a fact that we have to accept that stigmatized capitalism means that to destigmatize it, you have to have show the public at large that those who did wrong are punished. I mean, that's part of destigmatizing capitalism. You can't escape that. I mean, any notion that that's why under the IBC also it was necessary to exclude.
Promoters have been kept out.
Excluded. So I think that's a fact of democratic politics. I have some sympathy for that you have to accept. But I think therefore, but what you're saying is also right, that, you know, one can, I mean, this enforcement can get overzealous. I mean, that's just a reality.
Is it overzealous today?
No, I don't know this well enough to know whether it's overzealous, but I think it's certainly a risk. I think, you know, we've had these allegations of tax terrorism, overzealous enforcement. So I think that, you know, it's a tough call to make. I mean, on the one hand, you have to be seen to be punishing people. On the other hand, it can get out of control. So I think it requires a lot of judicious, both activism but also judicious restraint on the part of the enforcement agencies. I mean, I'm not an expert on enforcement. I don't know how you do this. My own view is that, you know, you have to do some of this, but I think it's better if you kind of use less heavy-handed measures, use carrots more than sticks for this. I mean, that's my, you know, for whatever it's worth, my two-penny view. But some amount of, you know, going after the guy who demonstrably did wrong things. How can you, you know, in democratic politics, how can you avoid that?
No, obviously, I understand that completely. But let me talk to you about the macro picture now. And you know, the government did inherit, to a large extent, fairly benign macros, and you worked on macro stability. You've been successful on that as well. Given where we stand today, inflation moving higher, the rupee today at 69, oil prices continue to edge closer to the 70+ sort of range. What would concern you most as far as the macro picture is concerned, and especially the external environment?
See, firstly, I think we have to be clear about levels and changes. You know, inflation is not at double digit it was 2013.
No, it's not.
Fiscal is not where it was. Current account is not where it was. So I think
I said that your report card on macro stability is good.
So, but there is I think it has, you know, the macro has become riskier relative to a few months ago. I agree. You're absolutely right on that. But I think, to me, I think certainly the biggest worry always for India is oil prices, right? I think oil prices may end up this year being 25%, 30% more than last year. I mean, that's a shock which will have an impact. I don't think we can kind of pretend that if oil prices go up, that inflation will not pick up. It can't, or that the current account deficit will not worsen. All these things will happen. All we can do is to see how we can buffer our economy against the, you know, the worst impacts of these shocks. That's all we can try. And also the whole trade war, currency war thing. We have to just, you know, we can control what we control. That means continuing the reform effort and, you know, holding the macro,
sticking to the path of fiscal prudence.
Exactly. All of this do no harm. I think that's kind of what I think. And if we, you know, end up next year, early next year, you know, having weathered this turbulence and volatility, I think we'll be in good shape. The country and the economy will be in good shape to accelerate the process of reform.
You know, I want to talk to you about one of the controversies during your tenure, and that was a fairly sort of public, not spat, but difference with the RBI on the issue of interest rates. And you put out a statement which was quite unusual, saying that the MPC ought to have cut interest rates, and the governor said declined the request of the finance ministry for a meeting. Where do you see interest rates headed now, and do you regret what happened then?
See, let me be very clear on this. I think my call for lower interest rates then, I think the public at large thought that, for 12 to 18 months, our real interest rates were very high. And I have no regrets about having that view that interest rates were too high. And, and everyone accepted that the inflation forecasting framework was consistently getting it wrong and one-sided and by large magnitudes. So I think for about 12 to 18 months, our interest rates were too tight. Now the question is, should that have been, expressed in public or not? And I think people can disagree on that. I believe in a theory of change which says that, you must be honest and give opinion in private. But sometimes if you think you can bring about change by expressing it in public, it should be done very sparingly, very responsibly, but it should be done if you think it's going to bring about the outcome. So that's one. Now I think the circumstances have changed completely, and I actually think I would commend the RBI for the way it's handled interest rate, exchange rate, use of reserves in the latest bout of turbulence. And my views are completely consistent. Then growth was slowing down, we had spare capacity, inflation was down, external environment was settled, capacity utilization was low. Now all of those things have turned. Growth is picking up, inflation is higher, we are under pressure from outside events. So I think you need to, your monetary policy has to change accordingly. So what I said then about the RBI, I stick by, and I would also like to commend the RBI for what it's done in the last few months.
How much of a concern or a challenge is the fact that we could potentially be seeing higher interest rates from here on and the impact on growth?
You see, I think that, look, I think we turn these things into these simple trade-offs between inflation and growth. Remember that, at some level, we have an inflation targeting framework, or rather, let's forget that, or rather we believe in, relatively low and stable inflation, because we think in the long run that's actually good for growth.
Yeah.
Right? So these trade-offs that we often posit in the short run are, I think, overdone. If, for example, inflation is going to go to 5 or whatever, 5, I'm not saying that, I think you have to take action to bring it down. Remember in the old days, there used to be, I've heard, former finance ministers express this iron law of political economy in India, that if inflation goes beyond a certain threshold level, I think the population reacts, the public reacts. And that's also the political logic also for having a target of reasonably low and stable inflation. So I think if inflation is going to go up, we have to take action. If that requires higher interest rates, so be it. But I don't think, therefore, you should say, therefore, it's a trade-off, because if you bring it down, you create the circumstances for more stable long-run growth and higher long-run growth.
Since we're talking about the RBI, let me ask you about an idea that you presented in the economic survey that was not taken forward, and that was using the Reserve Bank's excess capital of then 4 lakh crore rupees. Is that something that you hope will be taken forward at some point?
Oh, absolutely.
And you believe that it still holds merit?
I am actually, remember, I think, I've revised my opinions on a number of things. For example, like the bad bank. Yeah. I also think that, I forecast oil prices, not going above 60 to 65. I think I was surprised by that, and I whatever. But on this, I think I am reinforced in my view that, this has to be an essential ingredient of, whatever the blueprint for reform for the banking system as a whole going forward. I've said this before. I think that if you look at a post-global financial crisis, I have been struck, one of the things that's been really striking is how much central banks have been bold, imaginative in putting their balance sheet to the help, brought it to the assistance of the economy. And I think that the Fed did it, the ECB did it, buying all kinds of assets which they thought at that stage were kind of dubious marginal assets. They did that, allowed that to be used as collateral. And I think therefore, if you have a strong balance sheet, which is, after all, we're part of government, I think that should be brought to the assistance of the banking sector reform.
So by way of recapitalization?
that's the idea we had then, yeah.
Okay, let me talk to you about...
And I just want to say that, the debate at that time,
yes.
and Raghu and I
yes.
sparred in public on this. I think it was conservative central bankers. I think the popular narrative was conservative, responsible central bankers versus irresponsible finance ministry officials. But if you look at where central banking is headed now, that idea of excess reserves seems boring and conservative by the modern standards of where central banking is heading, just by the way. And I would love to have a new discussion with Raghu on this at some point.
What else have you disagreed with Raghu Ramrajan over?
No, we spar all the time. I mean, that's not a,
Including demonetization?
Well, that one...
I know you've often said that we shouldn't deny you the commercial value of your memoirs, but let me ask you a simple yes or no question. Were you consulted on demonetization? Yes or no?
No. You just said, why do you want to deprive me, of my commercial value?
It's a yes or no question.
Thereby could hang, whether, the book is going to sell. Well, I know that's not so. I mean, this is something that we leave for the historians. It's not even an interesting or a relevant question anymore. I think, as I keep saying, I think, at one level, when people ask you about demonetization, I think that there are three possible, I'm being slightly flippant now, there are three possible responses to this question. One is to say, like the millennials might say,
yes.
It's so yesterday. The other would be the Chow and Lai response, that it's too early to tell, like he said about the French Revolution. Or there's a third response, which Dr. Y.V. Reddy said, that that you check into a hospital after giving your views on it. So all three responses are possible.
Okay, I won't go down that road, but let me talk to you about an issue that is relevant today: agriculture. You've spent a lot of time talking about it in the economic survey, and you've said that it is a new challenge that requires a new way of thinking. And I think it would be fair to say that perhaps the government has underestimated the problem and the distress that the agriculture sector has faced. Do you believe that this is an area that has been a significant missed opportunity?
See, I said agriculture has surprised me quite a bit. I think that, in the first 2 years of the government, we had droughts and farm incomes were stressed. Then in the next 2 years, when monsoons were relatively better, and production went up, I thought frankly that agricultural incomes would improve, but that didn't happen. At least outside wheat and rice, the cereals, there was such downward pressure on agricultural prices so we have this odd paradoxical situation in India that regardless of how agriculture does in terms of output and production,
yes.
farm incomes remain stressed. So I think we need to understand this better. Why this is happening, I don't fully understand, but it also kind of little bit reinforces my view that we need fresh approaches to agriculture. I do think we need to think... Higher
MSP and farm loan waivers is not going to do it any longer.
I think, for example, more like direct benefit transfers, what I call quasi-universal basic income. I think we need to think more creatively about these, because I think, all the time we try and help farmers through indirect means, whatever they are. But I think the time has come to see, but given that we have now more and more the JAM architecture in place, why not think about helping farmers directly, which has lots of benefits. You can decouple production from income, you can reduce the distortions by way of subsidies and so on. So I think we need to think more creatively about, and the help should be more direct so that farm incomes can be, directly boosted. I think we need to think much more about that. And I think we need it, as I've said, and Minister Jaitley has also said, we need to do it in a cooperative federalism framework, because it can't be done by any one center.
Yes, because it involves the center and the states.
And we have to do it together.
Since we're talking about cooperative federalism, let me talk to you about the GST.
Right.
And that is something that you've spent a fair amount of your time on, even though the rate structure that you had designed was not finally taken forward. But we're talking about a meeting on the 21st, and I was just taking a look at what the Fitment Committee is actually going to be looking at. reduction or exemption for marble and stone deities, bamboo flooring, quota stones, sandstone, brass kerosene, pressure cookers. I mean, I get why we need, or why the government feels we need 5 rates, but to make it as complex and complicated as it is today, do you believe that this was not necessary?
See, I think the way I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I think the way I would put it is the following, right? I think there's been too much debate on whether there should be one rate or not one rate. We can't have one rate. We have to accept that. But I think we should have a debate on why can't we limit it to just 3 rates. That's where the debate should be, and that's where we should be headed. You know, we have one standard rate, one for all the demerit goods, and one for all the essential goods. I think that's how we should be headed.
But now they're talking about the possibility of another cess. I mean, you know, sugar cess has been discussed, luxury cess. Finally, no decision has been taken just yet, and states are opposing it, because today if you bring in a sugar cess, tomorrow, you know, Kerala will ask for a jute cess or rubber cess or whatever the case may be. So where do you draw the line?
But I think I think we should. I think the GST Council should get credit for not making things worse with another cess. I think at least give them that credit. But I think that's where I think we had. I think the 28% slab will be pared down over time. But I think over time, as revenues stabilize, we should be having this discussion of, you know, how soon can we get to, say, 3 rates? I think we should be having that debate.
Let me end then by asking you, of all the ideas that you've put forward, which one do you feel has been the most effective outside of GST, because we've just finished discussing that, and which one are you disappointed that it didn't get taken forward?
See, it's, you know, it's like asking to choose between your children, right? I mean, you have many children; they're all very valuable. No, I think that, see, I just want, and I do feel that what is important for someone like a chief economic advisor, obviously, you know, what gets taken up and implemented is immediately satisfying. But I don't think that should be the yardstick. I think I would like to go back and, you know, many years later reflect and, you know, did we, my team and I and all those we worked with, did we infuse the intellectual ecosphere with a bunch of ideas which permeated the system and which became the reference point for discussion? I would say, you know, twin balance sheet, now everyone talks twin balance sheet. JAM, it's become whatever, right? You know, universal basic income in some form or the other is doing. Stigmatized capitalism is becoming part. So I think, you know, and of course the surveys and so on. So I think, I do think that, you know, many things we try to do, as long as these form part of the discussion of ideas going forward, I mean, I would feel extremely gratified. I think there are also areas where we were not successful. I think, you know, for example, fertilizer sector, I wish we could have done more. I think agriculture also, I wish, you know, we could have done more. But overall, you know, the job of a chief economic advisor is just, you know, analysis, ideas, elevating the discourse. And, you know, if we've been even remotely successful on that, I'd be most gratified.
I'll end by asking you about the government's move on lateral entry. And I remember you said at an event a few days ago that you and Raghuram Rajan might want to set up a club to advise people on how they can potentially work with the government. What would your advice be? Or did I get that wrong? But you did speak about setting up some sort of a club to... No,
I didn't say that. No, not at all. What I said, I think, was that very simply that I'm all in favor of lateral entry. I think India needs, you know, Indian government needs all the talent and skill and expertise it can get. You know, doesn't matter where it comes from, internally in government, private sector, public sector, internationally. I think we need all the talent we can get, and therefore I think it's a great idea. Having lateral entry after all, I'm a lateral entrant myself, and I can't kind of not support this idea of lateral entry as well. I think what I was remarking on is the notion that somehow Raghu and I needed to embellish our CVs, and view this as some kind of, we come here to embellish our CVs. I think I probably will never have a job as exciting as this one. As I was saying, maybe for my next job I'll have to de-embellish my CV because it can never be as good as this, and people might think me overqualified for anything else that I apply for.
Peter Damron, the day that you put in your papers, did an interview with me, and he said that he had offered you the chief economic advisor's job, but then the UPA was almost at the end of its tenure, and he realized it perhaps wasn't the best thing to do. But he said that I hope he gets an opportunity with the future government. Would you consider one if it did come your way?
See, this is not a matter of governments. As I've said, I've told the minister, all my colleagues in government, that if they want policy advice, I will be only too happy to provide it. I will probably provide policy advice even if I'm not asked to provide policy advice. So, I will always be thinking about India and Indian policy no matter where I am. So I may be physically leaving India, but India is not going to leave me.
Well, Arvind Subramanian, we wish you the very best of luck. Thanks very much for joining us here on CNBC TV18, and we hope that you have an enjoyable innings at Harvard. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, you. Thanks.
With that, it is time for us to wrap up the CNBC TV18 special from all of us here. Goodbye. Many thanks for watching.